We are continuing our read of A to Z of horror. Today is C is for Chaos. This one is dedicated to H.P. Lovecraft. Problematic person. Still important. Okay. C. There is no field other than the weird in which I have any aptitude for fictional composition. Life has never interested me so much as the escape from life. H.P. Lovecraft. In the 1930s, the old gods enjoyed their golden age courtesy of one Howard Phillips Lovecraft, 1890-1937. His works plotted paranoid mythologies about the clash between man and the supernatural are dense and difficult, but for anyone interested in horror, completely indispensable. Despite his untimely death, Lovecraft remains one of the most important and influential authors of supernatural fiction. A lifelong resident of Providence, Rhode Island, he remained a studious antiquarian of most of his life. Poor health as a young boy led him to read voluminously, and the stories of Edgar Allan Poe, Lord Dunsany, and Arthur Machen inspired his own writing. Although he was never prolific, Lovecraft's fiction, revisions for other authors, poems, and essays received popular acclaim in the amateur press and through such pulp magazines as Weird Tales and Astounding Stories. In 1939, two young fans, August Derleth and Donald Wandry, established their own imprint, Arkham House, to publish posthumous collection, The Outsider and Others, and eventually bring all of Lovecraft's work back into print. During the decades since his death, H.P. Lovecraft has become acknowledged as a master of modern horror and a mainstream American writer, second only to his own literary hero, Edgar Allan Poe. Meanwhile, his relatively small body of work continues to influence countless imitators and has formed the basis of a worldwide industry of books, games, and movies inspired by his concepts. Brian Usna produced Reanimator, 1985, one of the most successful movie adaptations of the author's work, and he took over the directorial reins for its sequel, Bride of Reanimator, 1989, and co-produced and co-directed the Lovecraftian anthology movie Necronomicon, 1993. As a filmmaker, I've often gone to Lovecraft to get inspiration, he reveals. And when you read Lovecraft, I would defy you to tell me exactly what the story is about. It's very elusive, but the feelings of dread and horror are always there, and very palpably so. Visiting Providence, albeit 50 years later, really makes you feel like you're getting another dimension on his stories. Providence itself almost takes on a different cast. His stories were inspired by that town. Providence, where bay and river tranquil blend, where bay and river tranquil blend and leafy hillsides rise, the spires of Providence ascend against the ancient skies. And in the narrow winding ways that climb or slope and crest, the magic of forgotten days may still be found to rest. A fanlight's gleam, a knocker's glow, glimpse of Georgian brick, the sights and sounds of long ago where fancies cluster thick. A flight of steps with iron rail, belfry looming tall, a cinder steeple carved and paled, a moss-grown garden wall. A hidden churchyard's crumbling proofs of man's mortality, of rotting wharf where gambrel roofs keep watch above the sea. Square and parade, whose walls have towered full 15 decades long by cobbled ways mid trees embowered and slighted by the throng. Stone houses spanning languid streams, houses perched on the hill, and courts where mysteries and dreams of brooding spirit fill. Steep alley steps by vines concealed, where small-paned windows glow at twilight in a bit of field that chance is left below. My Providence, what airy host turns still thy gilded veins, what winds of elf that with grey ghost people thine ancient lanes. The chimes of evening as old above the valley sound, while their stern fathers neath the mold make blessed thy sacred ground. H.P. Lovecraft, May 1927. Quote, Lovecraft opened the way for me as he had done for others before me, Robert Bloch, Fritz Leiber, and Ray Bradbury among them. The reader would do well to remember that it is his shadow so long and so gaunt and his eyes so dark, puritanical, which overlie almost all of the important horror fiction that has come since. Stephen King. H.P. Lovecraft, Sanitary, Weird Tales, Stories. In a 1923 letter to one of his numerous correspondents, Lovecraft colorfully described in his antiquated style a walking tour he had recently undertaken of colonial Providence. Not a stone's throw from the traveled business section, tucked quietly in behind broad and Weybosset streets marked the beginnings of a squalid colonial labyrinth in which I'd moved as an utter stranger, each movement wondering whether I were in truth in my native town or some leprous, distorted witch Salem fever nightmare. This ancient and pestilential articulation of crumbling cottages and decaying doorways was like nothing I had ever beheld save in a dream. Rotting Doric columns rested on worn stone, steps out of which rusted footscapes rose like malignant fungi. Dirty, small-paned windows leered malevolently on all sides, and sometimes glasslessly from gouged sockets. There was a fog, and out of it and into it again moved dark, monstrous, diseased shapes. Providence writer and local historian Henry L. P. Beckworth, Jr., whose study Lovecraft's Providence and adjacent parts was published in 1979, claims to share a distant relationship with Lovecraft. We all go back to the same family, he explains. You're talking 300 years of people who lived here. Everybody in Providence probably reads his stories, but they're not going to talk about it much. And in a sense, he's almost a social embarrassment. That is a view that Michael Price of the John Hay Library, Brown University, agrees with. When I was growing up, I learned about Lovecraft from people who knew him. It was a kind of an underground thing. He wasn't considered a respectable writer, but in the genre, he was considered to be one of the best. He was also a local boy who made good, a peculiar local boy who made good, but a local boy nonetheless. For Lovecraft, the library in Providence was a special place because of his connection with that other great American fantasist, Edgar Allan Poe. Poe visited the library on a number of occasions, said Michael Price. I think one of the occasions the library held for Lovecraft was the fact that Poe had physically been there and his spirit, in some sense, still lingered. I believe that Poe's fiction is more important than his verse, Lovecraft wrote in 1921. The verse attains marvelous heights, but the tales are above all heights, fragments of cosmic perfection beyond the universe of dimensions. As a critic, he leads all other Americans, and only in humor did he fail. Of course, I may be prejudiced, since my own aesthetic perception is admittedly narrow and inclined toward those particular fields in which Poe worked. Lovecraft's own troubled life and his deep identification with Poe, another writer who died prematurely before reaching his fullest potential, had resulted in many people over the years attempting to psychoanalyze both the author and his influential body of work. He was an odd man with obsessional hatreds, reveals Brian Usna, which includes all forms of alcohol, seafood, dogs, and motion pictures. In his 1975 book, Lovecraft, a Biography, author L. Sprague de Camp concluded that he was a man who, as a result of congenital tendencies, his schizoid personality, compounded by an abnormal upbringing, was long delayed in maturation. He showed adolescent bumptiousness, prejudices, dogmatisms, affectations, and adolescent timidity towards new human contacts and relationships in his 30s, more than a decade after he had ceased to become an adolescent. In some respects, much as the sexual and monetary, he never did mature. Side quote, "Don't you take to rum and tobacco, Sonny, for they don't do anybody any good. They merely aggravate nervous susceptibility and disturbance, coarsen the mind and physique, harden and debase the appearance in every facial expression, and in short, ruin every vestige of that virtuous delicacy and fine honor which alone gives aesthetic value to the emptiness called life." H.P. Lovecraft. Quote, Lovecraft was an original in the Gothic tradition. He was a skilled writer of supernatural fiction, a master of the macabre who had no peer in the American his time, and only the fact that in America there is no quality market for the supernatural tale prevented his work from reaching a wider audience. By his own choice, he was in letters, as in his personal existence, an outsider in his time. August Derleth. H.P. Lovecraft in the movies: The Haunted Palace, Monster Terror, aka Die Monster Die, The Shuttered Room, and there's a list that ranges from 1963 all the way to 1995. Quote, "The first book of Lovecraft's I read made me into a writer. I read it in a single malingering day off school, and for a year or more I thought H.P. Lovecraft was not merely the greatest horror writer of all time, but the greatest writer I'd ever read. Ramsey, I'm so sorry, Mr. Campbell. Ramsey Campbell. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest fear is fear of the unknown. H.P. Lovecraft." Here's that movies list. And if anyone wants a picture of the movies list, let me know, and I will just upload a picture of the movies list. And I'm sorry, I am having a hard time speaking because my lips keep catching. And this is like the millionth time I've done this to myself, put on lipstick. that catches my lips. So hopefully this, I don't know, lip gloss will help. Both of Lovecraft's parents died in an insane asylum, explains local psychiatrist Dr. Eileen McNamara. His father at the age of 32, his mother began to hallucinate and died in the same hospital about 20 years later. As soon as his mother died, Lovecraft wrote a story called Beyond the Wall of Sleep, where he is a psychiatrist in an insane asylum. As a psychiatrist, he finds a degenerate man, his term, that he communicates with by attaching a special machine to his head, and discovers inside him is a noble soul from beyond the universe fighting noble causes. I really think this is a story about Lovecraft's father and his wish for him. His father died from syphilis, and I think Lovecraft was trying to say, my father isn't a degenerate patient. My father is a noble being, and I want to be with him again. That's what I think that story is about. I think that he was always worried, and the illness that made his father and mother go mad might have finally affect him. The death of my mother on May 24th gave me an extreme nervous shock, Lovecraft wrote to friends in 1921. Psychologically, I am conscious of a vastly increased aimlessness and inability to be interested in events, a phenomenon due partly to the fact that much of my former interest in things lay in discussing them with my mother and securing her views and approval. My mother was in all probability the only person who thoroughly understood me. Quote, it is to be noted that Lovecraft, like Poe, was fascinated by great natural catastrophes and new scientific discoveries and explorations, as is understandable in those who chose cosmic horror for his theme. Fritz Leiber. Quote, he was in reality a kind, considerate, courteous man, generous to a fault with his time and talent. Since his death more than half a century ago, Lovecraft and his work have been both revered and reviled. Robert Bloch. Quote, there had been eons when other things ruled on the earth and they had great cities. Remains of them were still to be found as Cyclopean stones on islands in the Pacific. They all died vast epochs of time before man came, but there were arts which could revive them when the stars had come around to the right positions in the cycle of eternity. They had indeed come themselves from the stars and brought their images with them. From the Call of Cthulhu, H.P. Lovecraft. And then we've got a section for books by H.P. Lovecraft. Here. He never spent a night away from home until he was 32, reveals Dr. McNamara. His mother hovered over him and doted over her only child, although she told him that he was very ugly, and also told him that he was a little girl up until about the age of 6. She dressed him up as a little girl, and he grew up with the crippling self-identity. Many of H.P. Lovecraft's tales are set in the theater-haunted towns of an imaginary area of Massachusetts or in the cosmic vistas that exist in dimensions beyond space and time. A number of these loosely connected stories have become identified as the Cthulhu mythos, named after one of his extraterrestrial deities. According to Brian Usna, what is really interesting is how a lot of Lovecraft stories deal with the spheres beyond. To understand Lovecraft, you really have to understand that that boy was looking up into the sky and there's a kind of horror out there. He seems to have given up the religious-oriented horror of the previous centuries and embraced the idea of a mankind that has somehow been abandoned by its gods, and the horror of Lovecraft is the horror of being inconsequential in the universe. In Lovecraft's view, it is absurd to believe that the universe was centered on human beings or that we had any real valid place or meaning, explains author, critic, and longtime Providence resident Les Daniels. This was just a gigantic chaos and meaningless madness in which we were all a tiny speck of no significance at all. He created fusion between science fiction and horror, which was unique, especially in the 1920s when he was working. He created the idea that the monstrous forces that were considered demons by primitive religions were actually extraterrestrials or interdimensional creatures. So that was sort of cosmic horror, which was different from the old supernatural horror, which was going out of vogue. And in doing this, he gave a new life to the horror story. We know that he got most of his ideas from his dream materials, reveals Dr. McNamara. He was a prodigious letter writer and document keeper. He wrote down his colorful, complex, vivid dreams and details, and he filled his stories with the dream material. In these stories, there are women who are raped by demons from outer space and give birth to monsters. Women are pretty much uniformly portrayed as treacherous, dominating, or dangerous figures. Of course, I am unfamiliar with amatory phenomena, save through cursory reading, admitted Lovecraft in a 1919 correspondence. I always assumed that one waited till he encountered some nymph who seemed radically different to him from the rest of her sex, and without whom he felt he could no longer exist. Then I fancied he commenced to lay siege to her heart in businesslike fashion, not desisting until either he won her for life or was blighted by rejection. But seeking affection for affection's sake, without any one special fair creature in mind, I was quite ignorant. Lovecraft's lack of experience didn't stop him from courting in the local graveyard, as Bart St. Armand, a lecturer in English literature at Brown University, explains. He was fascinated by the idea that Benefit Street once ran through the graveyard, and that the graveyard was moved, leaving some of the bodies scattered in some of the cellar holes. That's the origin of one of his most famous stories, The Shunned House, where one of the bodies has not been moved, but unfortunately it moves by itself. There was a favorite tomb for Providence residents, whether they are above the ground or below it. It was a place where Lovecraft courted, where Poe courted. There's evidence that he took his one sweetheart, Sonia Green, there and showed her his favorite spot. He would talk about Poe's life. He might even read a poem by Poe. On March 3rd, 1924, Lovecraft married Sonia Haft Green, a woman 7 years his senior. He said nothing would please him better, she later wrote. Sarah Helen Whitman was older than Poe, and that Poe might have met with her better fortune had he married her. However, within less than 2 years, the marriage was in trouble and the couple living separate lives. Sonia began urging Lovecraft to divorce her, and on the 25th March 1929, he signed a preliminary decree on the grounds of desertion. For the remainder of his life, Lovecraft made his home to his beloved Providence, but still managed to travel extensively as he eked out a living producing occasional short stories and ghost writing for other people's manuscripts. Providence, founded in 1636, is perhaps the most colonial of English and American cities, since the solid and generous nature of its early structures had discouraged its replacement, he wrote to author-artist Clark Ashton Smith in 1924. Providence's own realization of its Georgian quaintness is relatively recent. I was a pioneer in a kind of exaltation that the bulk of my solidly commercial fellow townsmen are just beginning to share. I've never had much inclination to depend on people for amusement. To me, all mankind seems too local and transitory in an incident in the cosmos to take at all seriously. I am much more interested in scenes, landscapes, and architecture. I have a very real affection for the old town with its ancient steeples and belfries, hills and corners, courts and lanes, all reminding me of that 18th century and that old England which I love so well. Quote, I found myself faced by names and terms that I had heard elsewhere in the most hideous of connections. Yugoth, Grey Cthulhu, Tesuga, Yothsuga, Relay, Narnlop, Azura, Pastor Yin Lang, the Link of Halley, Bookmora, the Yellow Sign, the Mercatholos, Gran, and the Magnum Innominatum, and was drawn back through nameless eons and inconceivable dimensions to worlds of outer entity at which the praised author of the Necronomicon had only guessed in the vaguest way. From The Whisper in Darkness by H.P. Lovecraft. Quote, what Lovecraft did have, which I think is very influential across the genre, is this extraordinary imagination. He was very po-faced, sorry, pun not quite intended, about the whole thing, but he did really believe or seem to believe in the stuff, and his conviction carries you through the stories, which otherwise I tend to find somewhat preposterous. It gives you the impression he means all the stuff. Clive Barker. Quote, these great old ones were not composed altogether of flesh and blood. They had shape, but that shape was not made of matter. When the stars were right, they could plunge from world to world through the sky, but when the stars were wrong, they could not live. But although they no longer lived, they could never really die. They all lay in stone houses in their great city of Ryla, reserved by the spells of mighty Cthulhu and a glorious resurrection when the stars and the earth might once more be ready for them. From The Call of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft. Quote, that is not dead which can eternal lie in strange aeons, even death may die. From The Nameless City by H.P. Lovecraft. And then we got a picture here of Sonia Haft Green. Quote, children will always be afraid of the dark, and men with minds sensitive to hereditary impulse will always tremble at the thought of the hidden and fathomless worlds of strange life which may pulsate in the gulfs beyond the stars or press down upon our own globe in unholy dimensions which only the dead and the moonstruck can glimpse. H.P. Lovecraft. And then we've got a picture here for which H.P. Lovecraft died from cancer early in the morning of 15 March 1937 at the Jane Brown Memorial Hospital. He was buried in the family plot in the Swan Point Cemetery, where his name was inscribed alongside those of his parents. 4 people attended the funeral service. Everything I loved had been dead for 2 centuries, he wrote in 1916. I am never a part of anything around me. In everything I am an outsider. But pray do not think, gentlemen, that I am an utterly forlorn, misanthropic creature. Despite my solitary life, I have found infinite joy in books and writing, and far by too much interested in the affairs of the world to quit the scene before nature shall claim me. A sense of humor has helped me to endure in existence. In fact, when all else fails, I never fail to extract a sarcastic smile from the contemplation of my own empty and egotistical career. And that is C is for chaos. And he is one of the main pillars of horror still to this day, besides being which we don't need to go into because it is just all out everywhere. But I don't know what my favorite H.P. Lovecraft inspired film is. Probably like to stick with something traditional like Reanimator. And Bride Reanimator is always, of course, great. I like, there's a Masters of Horror episode called the Dreams of Witch House. That one's pretty good. It's pretty interesting. And they do a really good job of expanding on the universe and everything. And then, of course, we just had that show, which I actually haven't watched because I don't have HBO. But I'm going to watch it when I get HBO, Lovecraft Country, which apparently does a really good job of getting rid of the racism, but also embracing the ideas. So that was C is for chaos. Next week, we have D for The Devil Rides Out. Thank you for reading with me. I will see you next week.